Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Heart of Hospice podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Hi, this is Helen, and I'm here to share some exciting news with you. During the month of November, the Heart of Hospice podcast is bringing you 4 special episodes featuring end-of-life educator Barbara Carnes. Barbara is going to be sharing stories about her hospice career that you've never heard before, talking about the lessons she learned along the way and her dreams for hospice in the future. She'll also be talking about her personal caregiving story and her grief journey following the death of her husband. Each episode will be published on Mondays during the month of November, which just happens to be National Hospice and Palliative Care Month and National Family Caregivers Month. You can hear the first episode on Monday, November 4th, so be sure to like and follow the podcast on your favorite podcast platform so you won't miss an episode. I want to thank my friends at the Death Deck for sponsoring this special series with Barbara Carnes. Be sure and check out their newest product, the End of Life Deck. With a casual tone and open-ended questions, the End of Life Deck makes starting conversations about what matters most a little easier. Visit thedeathdeck.com to learn more.
The Heart of Hospice podcast is being sponsored by the Death Deck, featuring the End of Life Deck. The End of Life Deck is used by many healthcare providers as a casual way to help start conversations about end-of-life wishes. It helps people communicate what matters most to them. To learn more about the EOL deck, visit thedeathdeck.com.
My guest, death educator Lee Warren, believes that preparing in advance makes a good death possible, and that's what she's working to provide in her community. Lee Warren is a death educator and end-of-life preparation guide. She was fortunate to learn about dying within the context of a village, when over the course of 2 years, the close-knit village of 125 people where she lived experienced the decline and death of 6 members whose ages ranged from 2 to 98. Those deaths and the generous people who experienced them offered an incredible opportunity to Lee to reweave a more holistic approach to end of life than the one that is generally offered to us. Lee helps folks who are engaged in a death and dying process to overcome their fear of death by being both internally and externally prepared. You can connect with her at queenofdeath.org. In our conversation, Lee shared the details of the principles of the eco-village where she lived and how the community supported the people who were dying there. Her approach to advanced care planning helps people envision their own personalized plan for their end of life. She often implements the Go Wish cards, great tool, to help people prioritize their death plan and figure out what's meaningful for them. Lee's hope is to bring death literacy to the forefront of people's minds. So enjoy this conversation with death educator Lee Warren. Lee, welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. It's great to have you with me.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm looking forward to this conversation. It's going to be great. We're going to do a deep dive, right, which is your nature and your soul. But we're going to start off with sort of an icebreaker first that I didn't send to you. So I'm going to blindside you a little bit. What comfort foods would you want if you were living your last days?
What comfort foods would I want if I were living my last days? I have this really restricted diet from a lifetime of chronic illness, so that's really an interesting question. And I often, this is another interesting part of it. I often think, oh, I'll have all the foods that I can't eat in my life when I'm dying. But the truth is, I want to actually be present and conscious when I'm dying. And so lately I've been having this conversation with my partner, and he says, do you want this ice cream? And I say, no, I can't really have that ice cream. It's going to hurt. I'll have it when I'm dying. But no, I don't really want to have it when I'm dying because I'm not going to feel good then either.
Right. Why make it worse? Why
Exactly.
make your symptoms crazy? Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, probably something I don't allow myself, which is like ice cream and yummy sweets, chocolate.
Yeah, I get that. And I think for a lot of people, especially in the United States, we have so many autoimmune and gut issues floating around out there that a comfort food may not be comfortable.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thought. I'm glad I asked you that. That's good. Okay, so we're going to be taking a deep dive today into the work that you've been doing with your community there in North Carolina. Very interesting work. And I never had anybody doing this type of work before who has been on the show with me. So thank you so much. We're going to be talking about how you came to work with the dying in your community. How did you even come to this work?
Yeah, let me give a little bit of background, which is that for the last 30 years, I've been a small regional part of what's sort of now becoming a global movement of eco-villages. And a quick definition of that is it's a consciously designed or intentional community that's holistically addressing the multitude of modern problems all at one time because they're all integrated, which is sort of an ecological framework, a social framework, an economic and a cultural framework, by trying to carve out a way of life that makes more sense sort of for the human genome and also but for the natural world and for how do we live sort of a more intact way. These are usually residential settlements. They can be urban, they can be rural, they can be large, they can be small, and they're all looking at regenerative ways, say wisdom ways, right? Sort of models of life-giving, scale-appropriate, planet-focused ways of being in tune. And so my story sort of has that as the backdrop. And I have been in a rural, independent income eco-village in Western North Carolina, outside of Asheville, since the late 90s. And it's about 150 folks, and there's a lot of focus on off-grid living and natural building and learning to grow food and fiber, doing participatory governance systems and how to get along with each other, how to resolve conflict. And really, it's a bit of a laboratory, an experiment of, is there a different way to do this than sort of what we've been taught or the roads we've been encouraged to go down? And so much like most people in the world, we weren't paying much attention to death until it came to us. And we had a series of 6 deaths over the course of 2 years. This was 2016 to 2018, and it really changed the landscape of our lives. And for some of us, more than others, who were sort of right in the center of tending these deaths. And because we were already oriented towards conscious living and social cohesion and experimenting, we saw it as an opportunity to dive into what does it look like to care for our own. And we really leaned in. 4 of those 6 folks declined at home. 3 of those folks died at home, and all of those folks had home funerals and home burials. So we were really fortunate to have this sort of infrastructure, social and physical infrastructure, that allowed us to experiment with reclaiming sort of the art of death and dying in community. And from that experience, several of us just sort of went quite deep into this process of, wow, this is where it's at, right? This is sort of where the secret sauce is of how to do this well. So that's a little bit of the background.
Interesting. So you were one of these people that found you had a natural interest, a natural gift, skills, talents, and a willingness to be present. I mean, that's a pretty amazing thing. Were you interested in care of the dying and death before that?
I wasn't, the breadth of some of the projects we take on in the Eco Village, it's a little overwhelming, like I didn't know how to farm and then I learned how to farm, and I didn't know how to build and then I learned how to build our own houses. And so it sort of comes with the territory of folks who are trying to recreate systems that make sense, is that they're sort of willing to jump in and be like, okay, we don't know about this, but we had this way of learning, and I like to think of I have these 4 pillars of like what guided us to that place. And I want to say the first component, the first pillar that guided us was the dying themselves, who were embedded in this social fabric and saying like, I want to be here and I want to do this consciously, and I want help doing this. And so we were already deeply invested in these relationships. So that was a huge guide. And then another guide was really good mentors. We reached out to our extended community and found some really amazing mentors that helped us move through this process. A couple of Buddhist nuns who taught us about after-death care, home funeral, home burial. We had, many of us had trained in grief work with a woman named Soban Fusome, who's of the Dagara tradition in West Africa. So we pulled together mentorships and we said, we're in need, necessity is the mother of invention. We have a need. Can you come help us? And so we were able to walk through these processes because we wanted to really do it in our community. And then another pillar was what I call the synergy of traditions. We have some really amazing folks that are drawn to community who've studied in all kinds of different spiritual traditions, and we're pulling all of that beauty together. So we have folks that are practicing Zen Buddhists. We have other folks that have practiced with Native American traditions. We have midwives. We have all kinds of people from different backgrounds that were able to bring this synergy of traditions together to make a whole. Like the idea of you can't raise a child without a village is like you can't curate a good death without a village, right?
Right.
And then the 4th pillar, so we learned from the dying, we learned from the really good mentors, we learned from this synergy of traditions, and then the 4th one is this sort of evolutionary pattern within us just emerged, right? And I want to say, like, we know how to do this. Parts of us really do know how to care and move into the sort of center of the circle, like you said, in the real core of the holding of the hand and the caring for the dead. And then there's concentric circles outside of that for people who may not want to be as close in, but who might want to dig the grave, or who might want to help people park for the funeral, who might want to make food for the caregivers, right? And so these concentric circles set up so that people could self-select where they wanted to be in that process. And that is the evolutionary programming that sort of, when it's allowed, when there's room for it, can kick in and emerge as a really creative way to step in.
What I hear you saying is really about how the community unlearned all of these things that modern medicine, the healthcare system that we have in the U.S. has conditioned us to expect when it comes to death and dying. Basically, what you're doing is what humans knew how to do for centuries before we had all these quote unquote advancements.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the funeral industry didn't pop up until industrialization, right? And it was in the mid 1800s to late 1800s. And only then was it in big cities. Everyone cared for their own at death. This
Right.
was our ancestry. It's not that long ago, and if we are, as a group of people who've been sort of questioning the cultural narratives for decades, this was in keeping with sort of our ethos of like, wait, I think we want to do this, to the point where we would go to the local morgue and get the body and bring it home. And the sort of the morgue director is like, oh, you all again, for goodness sake, you got used to us.
Bunch of weirdos. Is that what,
Exactly.
Yeah. But it truly is touching back on traditions that we had for years. I mean, embalming didn't even come into being or use until the Civil War, when they needed to embalm bodies and preserve them. So there's so much to unpack in this. I want to talk about family-directed or self-directed death care, because this is I'm going to say re-emerging tradition that people are finding to care for their dead and dying in their own homes, right? We still have a lot of people that die in the hospital that don't necessarily want to, but more and more people are dying at home with caregiver and family support, along with hospice care when they choose to do that. So let's talk about the benefits of family-directed death care. What would you say are the biggest benefits of family-directed death care?
Yeah, I just want to shout out to hospice for bridging this for decades. That hospice has been a bridge for so many of us to normalize death. The other questions you've asked me, I'm going to set some context, which is I assume when I'm teaching, when I'm working with a client, that we are all healing from death denial, death illiteracy, death negativity, and death phobia. That's where I start. And what that means for us is that we're not around the death very often. The contemplation of death has never occurred to us. Grieving death is not something that's accessible to us. And so we don't have access. This is all, we're guided by these institutions because the body is swept away, right? At the moment of death, we are in grief, and then we do what we're sort of told to do. Right. We don't have elders in this work. I mean, it's happening more and more. This podcast, other amazing things. We don't have a relationship to the ancestors on the other side of the veil. We just don't have access. And so when we're starting from that point, and that we are procrastinating or avoiding preparation for death, we have misinformation when we're helping a loved one, or a lack of information. We are sort of the most heartbreaking thing for me is that we're really disconnected from the profound truth that death is a part of life. And from that place, all things are possible. But because we don't swim in these waters, any act of consciousness around any aspect of death is a really important and empowered choice for families, because death was never meant to be weathered alone, and neither is grief, and neither is fear. And in our culture, due to whatever we want to call it, modernization, industrialization, capitalism, we're isolated and alone. And so we're in the business of survival, and from economic distress or trauma or both. And so we don't really know how to get there. It's a bit like swimming upstream. And I don't want, with my background and experience, I don't want to set this high bar of like, now you need to go create a village because you need to die well. Because that's not necessary. We can incorporate small, meaningful things into ritual aspects or conscious aspects into every part of the death process. And so what I think of is, if families can achieve some clarity about their end of life wishes, create a roadmap for what that looks like, start to do some internal preparation for death as well, then they have some tools and some knowledge and some empowerment to carry those wishes out. And the benefits, you started the question is like, what's the outcome of that? Like, it makes every single part of the process easier, more peaceful, more heartful, more connected, more intimate, more honoring. And then up until that process, there's a lot of relief knowing that affairs are in order. You continue to be able to cultivate the qualities that make for a good death, however you define that, and really alignment with your own essence. We use different words for this: your divinity, your soul, your nature, the cycles of life and death. When you're connected to that, things can flow.
It seems to me that when you talk about family-directed death care, it's all about creating what you consider a good death. We have a tendency, especially healthcare people, to decide what a good death should look like, right? All the symptoms are managed. You're at home in your bed. Your family's right there. You die peacefully, and they grieve appropriately. I've seen that documented so many times on death visit notes. But really, isn't family-directed or self-directed death care, isn't that about creating an individualized experience that creates whatever that person defines as a good death?
I think the qualities you listed is a fabulous place to start. And then as one gets more literate, more sort of death positive, more intimate with their own preparation and their own journey, then that can get tweaked and nuanced to that person's essence. For example, I have one client who has taken my classes and is like, I don't want anyone in my life to stress about this, so I'm going to write things down. But the truth of the matter is, I travel constantly, and the chances of me dying somewhere else are quite high. And I'm going to talk to my family, and I'm going to write this all down because I'm leaning into a certain level of wildness. And that's sort of what I want to bring to my death. And it's like how to craft one's end of life roadmap and talk to the family members when that's the essence that's guiding you.
Right.
That's really different than what someone else might want.
Absolutely. And we don't get to tell someone else what their good death should look like.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Yeah. Not everybody wants to die in their own bed. Not everybody wants an audience. Right. I mean, seriously, some people consider that a very private thing.
Yeah.
Depending on relationships and nature and of who they are. I think that's pretty cool. This conversation is so good, but we're going to take a quick break. Hang on for more great content.
The Death Deck has created a new tool they call the End of Life Deck, or EOL Deck. The EOL deck can be used by families, caregivers, and healthcare providers to help facilitate conversations about end-of-life wishes. Using multiple choice and open-ended questions, the EOL deck has a casual tone that makes starting conversations about what matters most a little easier. Here's hospice nurse Helen Bauer from Hospice Navigation Services sharing the value of the EOL deck.
The EOL deck jumpstarts the conversations we all need to have with finesse, compassion, and honesty. It treats end-of-life discussions with thoughtfulness and respect. Every end-of-life worker should have a deck.
To learn more about the EOL deck and to purchase this helpful conversation starter, just visit thedeathdeck.com.
Okay, so how about the term values-guided death care? What does that mean for you? How would you define that?
What I do in my end of life preparation education is I help people prepare both internally and externally. And the values are woven through that. And because, once we get on a roll and normalize the conversation and consider that death might not be the enemy, a whole world of creativity opens up and people start to be able to settle in to their own system. And so we go through, every sort of bucket of external planning, which is the end of life directives. I call it designing your sacred decline, right? And honoring the container, right? So we talk about healthcare agents, we talk about patient advocacy, we talk about medical interventions, we talk about pain management, we talk about DNRs, we talk about, all of it, and the real practical components of that. And so that helps people settle in to, well, what have I seen in the world? What can I research in the world? And what feels true to me? What feels true for, my values, my process? We also talk about returning the vessel. How do you want your vessel returned? What does that look like? What are your after death options? Do you want a vigil? Do you believe the spirit stays with the body for a certain number of days? What's true for you? So we go through all of those external components, and right alongside of that practical stuff, we do the mystical stuff. We look at what are the qualities that make for a good death for you, and can you cultivate those qualities, and can you let those qualities inform you? What are the characteristics of traditions that you feel excited about? What are the characteristics of traditions that you feel really like, no, thank you. I've seen that, done that. I don't want that. What does it look like? We even talk about tuning into the blueprint of the self. How do we look at embodied, the wisdom in the body for dying? How do we look at psychedelics and the practice of dying? How do we look at all of that? And we actually also do a module or a segment on the blessed giveaway, which is, what do you want done with all your stuff, including your financial assets? All of these things, like what are your bucket lists and your last wishes and your legacies? And so when we're sinking into all of this, it allows people to really watch what rises to the surface for them, what's important to them. And then, as in all things, in my death education, I usually say, well, in one hand, we hold this finely nuanced design. And in the other hand, we hold, you get what you get, because
Yeah.
we might not be able to create that, but
Yeah.
the preparation will serve no matter what happens, because this preparation is of an internal and external versions.
So everything a person holds valuable, everything they believe spiritually, through religion, their beliefs, their ethics, their standards, all their values, all of that gets woven through, from what I hear you saying. All of the advanced care planning, all of the emotional and psychosocial searching and sussing out that they do. Their values are written through everything. But I love the point that you're making about sometimes things don't happen the way you expect. So isn't it even more critically important that you don't just write that stuff down and you don't just research it inside yourself, do the internal work? You have to talk and communicate it somehow to those who surround you and will support you as you do this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, you've made several good points there. This piece about a death plan, much like a birth plan, we
Right.
have to set it up so that we are not failing if we don't get what we designed, right? And I think
Right.
it's really important. We can certainly grieve We can grieve something if it wasn't what it looked like. But part of death literacy is coming to terms that we may not have agency in certain areas that we really want it. And I love the Go Wish cards. If you haven't, have you seen those Go Wish
Yes.
cards? It's
Yes.
a little card game where you get to lay out your, primary, secondary, and third sort of desires. There's little qualities and characteristics on each card. And when you play that game in a group, what you do is you subgroup the groups out and you say, okay, this group over here, you've just been in a car accident with your healthcare agent and you only can pick two of all of these cards, right? So you start to play with these cards and you realize, like, wow, you know, while all of these things are my ideals, I may actually have to let go of them. And so this is part of death literacy, is what's really important to me. Awesome. That's really great to identify. And how can we hold these things lightly, just like life, right? And the more we can do that, the better prepared we will be for whatever comes our way.
I love what you're saying about using the Go Wish cards. That's one of my favorite things, to help determine your priorities. So what I have found when I've used Go Wish for myself is almost all of that stuff seems important. But that's not how you play the game, right? You're only supposed to pick out, I don't know, the top 5 or 10.
Yeah.
Top 10 or so of the things that are, super vital, non-negotiables, right? And I'm looking through all of that and I'm like, well, I want, I'm at Luby's and I want a little bit of everything, right? All of these things are important to me. So it's interesting that you make that point about some of these things can't happen for you. So if you have to choose between only 2 things, which would you choose? To really mine down and pinpoint what's important.
Right. And that comes back to the previous conversation about the characteristics that are needed for a good death. And there are some universal ones. And at the Go Wish game illuminates, like, letting go is probably a practice that we could all benefit from sooner rather than later. Letting go of our preferences, letting go of control, letting go, of the outcome that we wanted.
Right. Expectations.
And since we're all moving towards death, the more practice we have at that, like the Go Wish game, it's a really important reflection to us of, like, ooh, wow, can I even grieve some of these in this moment that I might not get them? Can I process that now? And that's what end of life preparation at its best helps us do. It helps us every day use the certainty of our own death as a way to be more fully present, as a way to cultivate these things that allow us to realize the temporariness of our existence.
So what you're saying is, by having these conversations and doing this reflection, these reflective activities, we're able to begin grieving in advance. I hate using that word because it leads us to advanced care planning, which is such a medical procedure, right? It's totally about documentation. But advanced care planning is really about what you're talking about. If it's done fully and completely and robustly, that's what it does. Yeah. It's not just about the legal paperwork.
Right. It's the practical and the mystical. They need to go hand in hand. And without the practical, we don't really come face to face with our mortality. And without the mystical, we're just terrified, right? So we need both. And what happens is, the more one contemplates, that fear tends to loosen. And what fills in the gaps is actual gratitude. What fills in when we start to use death as a daily contemplation, we have access to so much gratitude for this moment that will never happen again. That life becomes really rich. And therein is the paradox of death preparation. What I say makes for a more ecstatic life, because we have access to the reality that this is such a gift.
Beautifully put. So you mentioned death literacy earlier. What do you think people need to know? And this is probably a whole podcast interview, probably another conversation by itself, but in a nutshell, right? What do you think people need to know to be death literate?
Yeah, I mean, if I could boil it down to one single word, it's curious, and how can we get curious about what it means to die? And wherever there's a sort of crack in the facade of denial, like, can we use that curiosity to sort of wiggle our way through? I have sort of this framework that I use, which I'm happy to share with you. But again, it boils down to that, like, can we peek out from under the covers enough to say, what's here? What is here? I use these sort of 4 pillars. Again, I love my 4 pillars. One is embracing death as teacher, death as gift. And that does sort of prime the pump of curiosity. What does that mean? What does it mean that death is a gift? Is it a gift to me as the dying person? Is it a gift to the people around me when I die? And so that's a sort of an ongoing inquiry that I really love to pose. And then the second pillar is designing your own decline. And that has such a component of self empowerment that really drives the sort of bus of death literacy. The third pillar I use is embodiment, mindfulness, and contemplative practices. And there's just a host of things. It could be poetry for one person and chanting for another person and movement for another person that really help us open our to our larger selves, however people want to call that, the higher self. And that's crucial in death preparation work. And then my fourth pillar is sort of giving and receiving support in community. And we weave again back to this, and community does not need to be residential or intentional. It's just, it could be the Death Cafe movement. It could be, gathering a group of people to do a book club. It could be, being present when someone's talking about the grief of losing a spouse. So how do we build more death literacy in our communities? And that really, those sort of 4 for me shape what gets us there, driven by the motor of curiosity.
I like that. Open-mindedness. Open.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've been doing this for a while, being very present with the dying in your community and educating so much. Tell me about a time when you were companioning someone who was dying and what you learned during that experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the 6 folks that died during that 2-year period of time, her name was Kim or Kimberly, and she went by the nickname of Kimchi. And she was very beloved in community, and she had what we often refer to in community as a lot of social capital. She had done a lot for the community. She was a very personable and likable being. And so the community really rallied around. She knew she was dying for about 6 months, and really she was committed not only to a conscious death, but making it an educational experience for folks in the community and beyond. So we did photos and we did videos and we did interviews, and we were really able to sort of, we formed a death care team, about 6 women around her, and created the kind of decline that she wanted. She was living in sort of a rustic building without plumbing, and so another member of the community gave up their house so Kimchi could move into it because it had plumbing and handicapped accessibility, so she could die in her home. And this was, this is not the kind of stuff that happens in the world.
Right.
But we sort of, the community really rallied around that. And I don't want to romanticize death. I don't want to, I don't want to leave out the fact that it can be scary and painful and hard and messy and all of those things. But I do believe that this experience is what catapulted me and others of us to really start inquiring about what a gift death can be. because we make it harder in our culture by not having these conversations. And so Kimchi's death really, it brought us together in a way. I mean, I've been living in this kind of eco-village and community for 20 plus years at the time. I wasn't a newbie to community. I was very, very seasoned. And it brought our community together in a way I've seen nothing else before or since. And I believe that death in some ways is designed to bring us together and to cut through some of the sort of BS that we fight about and we struggle with. And her death was such a blessing for us. It showed us, it gifted us so much. Because she was able to receive love and support from others, she was in acceptance and some level of relaxation, not that she didn't have her moments, and some amount of rejoicing and being in the mystery. And to have someone in that kind of space go through the death process, it just just so many blessings for all of us. And that was what was so life-changing for us, was her death. And I'm so grateful, the generosity of that, her experience and how it impacted my life. And the fact that that was a mentorship moment for me. That's what I want to create. That's the kind of death that I want to have. And I want to help other people create the kinds of deaths that they want to have.
Yeah, she was very generous in allowing you guys to be in community with her while she was doing this. That's not an easy thing for some people. Some people, no. It's very private, or their fear is very private for them. So that's understandable.
Yeah, she was an extrovert, and there was definitely things that she did, including having people, sort of the revolving door of people coming to see her, even in her last days, that I would not recreate. And that was a learning for me also, which is I'm more introverted, or I'm more internal. But the big learning was I can be conscious about what this looks like.
Right.
I mean, there were hundreds of people at her funeral, and we had her funeral in our big communal building called our council hall. And even the funerals, the home funerals and the home burials, were life-changing for people. Just how real and authentic and embodied, and really just the body being with us and moving towards the grave. And we dug our own, grave. And she was actually buried on her birthday, which is a really interesting component. So the whole group sang her happy birthday as we put her in the ground. And so, there was an element to it of, I don't know, just bridging so much.
It's interesting when you talk about how you have seen and experienced. You're actually designing your own advanced care plan, your own death design, as you watch other people doing what they want to do, making their own choices. And isn't that a really wonderful part of advanced care planning? But you have to be in community with somebody who's dying, be curious about it or open to the experience to even gain that awareness about yourself. Like you're saying, you're an introvert. You wouldn't want to create that particular circumstance of having all these people trek through your home.
Right.
Yeah. But if you had not been willing, and she had not been willing to allow you into the experience and you to step into it, you maybe never would have learned that about yourself.
Yeah.
For you to be able to tell your own family, it's not a spectator sport for me. Don't have everybody here. I don't like it.
Yeah. And as we get more death literate as a culture, we have more of those films, and we have more of those books, and more of those podcasts, and more of those ways we can learn from how everyone else is doing it. And that's what death literacy is. It doesn't have to define how I do it, but it gives me a model for the curiosity, for the design, for the fact that I can be creative with my own process.
Yeah. How beautiful is that? So much meaning attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
Lee, how can my listeners connect with you, find out about the work you're doing and the courses that you offer?
Yeah, so my website is queenofdeath.org. And that's a place you can enter your email address and get on my mailing list. And I keep an ongoing weekly sort of newsletter journal of conscious dying. commentary, and it's a great way to connect.
Awesome. You're awesome. Thank you so much for a beautiful conversation. I love the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Helen. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes, and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.